Hello and welcome to my video about the use of routers with router templates specifically. This is the third video in a series I'm doing on how to use routers, and I'll provide links to the other videos, but today we're going to focus almost completely on how to use router templates. I'm going to talk about in this video how we connect the template to the piece of wood. There's a variety of ways to do it. How to set up your router and what the correct router bits are to use when you're working with the template. And I will cover both a router table and a handheld router in doing that. And I'll just give some examples along the way showing how it's all done. To make this a little bit more fun, the example I'm mostly going to be using as we complete this, doing both outside and pocket routing with a template, is to create a game called Mancala. I just came up with this template right now, and we'll use these pieces of alder right here to make that game as we go along. But mostly we're going to talk about how you work with a template. And we'll start by talking about how we attach the template to the wood itself. I know of 4 common ways of attaching your template to the wood piece that you're going to be working with. And I'm going to go through all 4 of those, and I'm going to do that in order of my least favorite, or the one I use the least amount, to my most favorite, and the one that I use the most. Some of them are more appropriate for different situations. Before we do that though, one thing you should be aware of on any of your templates is whether they have any markings that are going to assist you in lining them up. This Mancala game can be done in a full piece, or it can be done in 2 halves. And when you're working with a full piece, you actually want the end piece to line up with the end of the template. But if you're working with the full piece, you actually want that distance between the circles that's going to happen on the other side to be the same as all the other distances, and so you only want to go half that length. Because of that, there is this marking guide that is on the template, and you can line that up with the edge of the board that you're going to be working with, and when you set it, you want to line up there as opposed to there. So it depends on what you're going to do. A lot of templates come with various markings, and you should get to be familiar with those before you use the template. Now on to the way we attach it. The first method that I know of is to use tape, just regular masking tape like this, and just go ahead, and once you've got it in place, put it both on your template and try and get as much slack out of it as you can, and then put it on the board that you want to attach it to as well. And when you do this particular technique, the more tape that you can get on there, the better. So I put it here on both of these sides, and then I've got a way of holding my template down while I do the pocket joints, for instance. Now obviously the limitation to this is wherever that tape is, you can't do a cut there. So you may have to be moving this around a little bit, and the other problem is often if you don't get that tape all the way pushed up against the edge there, you'll end up with a little bit of wiggle room. But it is the easiest way and the way that most people already have the materials for. So if that's what you'd like to do, give it a try. If it's not wiggling on you at all, then it's a perfectly fine solution. The second method also involves tape. Only in this case, we're going to use double-sided tape. And when you use double-sided tape, you don't need to use quite as much as before. You can generally work with little squares that you cut off of there. Attach one side usually to the template first to make sure you're not covering any of the holes that you want to attach to, and the other side to the board. With this particular piece, this is actually a more difficult way of doing it because most of the template here is something we need to cut out. I could get little squares, I think, right here and push those down, and it would work. And with several templates, this is a great way to go. So if you have some double-sided tape, or you can get your hands on some of them, that's a nice way to do it. Just know that when you peel it back up again, it might leave a little bit of residue from the tape, both on the piece, which you're probably going to sand anyways, but also on your template, and a little cleaner will take all of that off. But there is one way that's, I think, even better than that, that acts much the same way as the double-sided tape, and that's what I want to show you next. The third way that you can attach templates to your board is by a method that you probably have used in other crafts, and this is hot glue. Now this is the method I probably use the most, even though I like the last one even better than this one. But it works very well and works in almost all applications. And all the idea is to take on the back of your template and apply a little bit of this hot glue and just stick it down where you want to. The hot glue gives you a little bit of working time to position it just where you want. Hold it there, and pretty soon it'll be set up the way you like. It's just as simple as this. And there you have it. Just like that, in a couple of seconds, it's set up even better than that tape ever will. I'll show you how to take this off after we've made a cut. The final method that I'd like to show you today to attach your template to your piece is to actually use screws, like these little 5/8 inch hinge screws, attached typically through countersunk holes. That's if you're routing on the top, or not countersunk if you're using a router table. Now, obviously the downside to this is that it will leave a little hole in your piece. And if you're using it in the middle of the piece like this, maybe that's a non-starter for you. If you are going to do a painted piece, sometimes that is okay. You can put the hole in there, use a wood filler to fill it over, and then just paint it, and it'll be just like it wasn't even there. However, it's not always possible to do that, especially if you're going to use the wood grain as the final surface. But it is sometimes possible if you have an outside edge that you're going to be cutting off later. So you'll see that this template comes in two different varieties, one with the tabs on the outside and one with no tabs. This one with no tabs allows me to do a flush trim around the entire outside perimeter of the template and get the final piece. But I also know that this is a square cut, something I can do easily with a table saw or a miter saw. And so if I have a little bit of extra wood that I'm working with, then why not put that into that wood that's going to be going away, hold it right into place where I need it to be. I can mark it, take it off, put it back, and it will go right back into the exact same guide holes. And I'll know I'll have it perfectly lined up every time. So when I can, I'd like to use that method, and I'll show you that when I do this full Mancala board, whereas I'll use the hot glue as I do this fold over half Mancala board. I'll set that up right now and we'll make some cuts. There is one consideration that you need to keep in mind before you start any of your cuts with the router, and that is that it's probably best to have as little material to route off as possible. It makes it safer and easier to handle when you're doing it that way. And so it's often a good idea to just go ahead once you've placed your template down to mark it, even with a thick pin like this one, because you're not going to be cutting right up to the edge, you're just going to be cutting close to it and removing whatever material you can using a different kind of saw, a band saw, scroll saw, jigsaw, table saw even for this particular cut. Now when you're working with inside pockets like this, I'm not going to go all the way through on this particular one, but if you were, the best way to do that is to get a jigsaw and a drill. Drill a pilot hole through there first so that you can put your jigsaw into that area and then just cut out the remaining bits with your jigsaw. In a nice rectangular form like this, go ahead and put 4 pilot holes, one in each corner, and just use your jigsaw to cut in between the 4. So let me show you how I cut these out. I often do it with the template still attached, but if you're new and you want to not risk your template itself, go ahead and pop that template off, make the cut, and put it back on again before you round any of the pieces out. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I'd like to show you how to do these cuts both on a router table and using a handheld router. And there are differences that you need to keep in mind when selecting the router bits and using each. In this case, when we're going to do the outside of the template, the easiest way to do that is using a router table. You don't have to. If you don't have a router table, you can certainly do it with a handheld router. I might recommend though, if you're going to do something like an inch here, maybe do it in a few passes because the control is a little bit more difficult. The more important thing though is the bit selection, and we have a variety of choices here. To begin with, you can think of the different sizes of the bits. A bit like this is actually easier to control when I work with it, when it's bigger than this one right here. But it has the drawback, of course, of not being able to cut into tight little corners or anything with a lot of detail in it. This can't really get that detail. It would be great for something like this though, except that it doesn't have the height to get the entire piece. A bit like this is a little bit taller and it's a little bit narrower, so it's able to do some of those little inside corners or jags or whatever they happen to be. If there's a little more detail, you can use it. The other difference that you might have noticed is that the bearing on this one, they're both flush. The bearing is at the bottom, whereas on this one it is at the top. That means if I'm working with this one in the router table, I actually have to flip my piece upside down, and I won't be able to see my template as I'm making the cut. That might be a consideration for you. With this one, I keep the template straight up and I bring my router up or down inside of the table until the bearing is matched flush with the template itself and the blade is with the piece of wood. Another consideration is the shape of the blades in the bit itself. Both of these are straight cut bits. The blade runs entirely vertical up and down. These are the most common bits. They're less expensive than the other varieties, and you'll probably have these laying around in your shop if you use routers at all. In terms of removing material though, there's an advantage to using these spiral cut bits instead. And these spiral cut bits come in different varieties. They come in upcut, downcut, and compression. This one is an upcut bit. And when you're thinking of up and down, you need to think relative to the router if you were using it as a palm router as opposed to a router table. This one, as it spins, will bring the chips and dust that it creates up into the router and not push it down into the piece itself. A downcut bit does the opposite. Its blades are set up so that the material itself is being pushed down. So if you're going all the way through the material, that's great, and it creates a better surface at the top of what you're working with. There's also something called compression bits. And in those bits, they have half of them that work up and half that work down, just to give you an even smoother cut. Now, using these inside of a router table, I find to be the best thing to work with. When working with a handheld router, the additional torque that comes off of the spiral makes them a little bit more difficult to control, so you might want to consider switching over to a straight when you get to that particular point. But the table is holding this router in place for me, so I'm going to use this bit, and I'll show you how I do that to trim off the edges on our Mancala board. A couple things to keep in mind quickly before we do the cut. And the first is that you don't actually need to have a special template to be your template or your guide for your bits. The piece itself can do that. And they make these little rabbiting bits, for instance, where the bearing can run up against the outside edge of the piece, and the blade will cut a portion of that piece underneath where the guide is running. And you're perfectly fine changing these bits out yourself. I keep a bag full of bearings of a variety of sizes, and it just takes a little Allen wrench to pop that bearing off, take it out, and replace it with another one, so you can cut whatever you like. And that's true both for the top bearings and for the bottom bearings. The last thing to keep in mind is safety. Router tables are notorious for wanting to kick back, and you want to always be providing resistance against the blade as it's spinning. In this case, the blade is going to be spinning this way, so if I have the board on this side, I want to push it this way. On this side, I want to push it this way. I also highly recommend getting safety paddles and using them. You'd be surprised how much additional friction and protection you get by using a safety paddle instead of your hands when you're moving these boards around. Eye protection, ear protection, all the standards. We'll use all that and we'll get this cut going. So now that we've covered the use on the router table, let's talk a little bit more about how you would do this with a hand router, in this case, this palm router. And it's actually pretty simple in most cases. I have a plunge bit inside of here. I can simply push it right through, and I have this bearing, which is at the top of the router and will match up against my router plate. It's flush so that when I cut this, it will match exactly the hole that's in there. And that's your majority case. But there are some cases that we need to consider that are a little bit more complicated. For instance, what if I wanted a rounded hole on the outside edge here, I wanted to use a bit with this shape to it. This is a round shape, common like you might see on a cutting board with the juice groove that goes around the edge. In this case, I might want to have a rounded portion to it and then just hollow out the middle. Well, I can go over with that rounded portion on the perimeter, but this is a very bad blade for pocketing out the rest of the material inside of it. So I'd like to use this bit to do the rest of the material. Unfortunately, it's flush and it would take away the rounded over edge that I put in with this one. Well, there's a couple ways to deal with that. Like I mentioned earlier, you can take out the bearing and put in a larger one that makes it so that the offset is the radius of this bit and you get it just right. The other alternative is to work with a templating system. And this is an example of the templating system. There's a bushing that goes into this particular router plate, which will provide you the offset. And I have a set here, which gives me a whole bunch of options for how big that offset can be. So I would simply put in the offset that gives me the amount of offset from this radius over, and I can use my flush trim bit inside of that and hollow out the portion that I need. The other place where it's advantageous to use these is if you need to get into a very narrow little part of the template. And let's say we're working with this bit. It has the 1/4" shank like most of our other handheld bits will, but it is actually an 1/8 inch tip. And that 1/8 inch tip, you won't be able to find a bearing that will work with it. So it's best to work with a bushing system like this, where you put that bit in there and it will provide the buffer. That does mean though that you need to find a template that supports the offset that you're going to get between the bit and the bushing. So you don't want to necessarily have a flush one like this. Look for one that has the offset that you're looking for. It makes the template look a little worse, but it makes the cut look a lot better. Now this particular bit fits in perfectly with that little system, but there's an even better way of centering it. And that is to take a little tool like this, which works on the 1/4 inch shaft, goes right into your tool. You can tighten it up on there. And while your base plate is not completely secured down, it's still loose and has a little give to it. Center that where you want it and tighten the plate down. This will perfectly center your plate with its bushing to the shaft that's beneath it. And if you don't do that and you're working with something that has a symmetric pattern to it, you might see a little lopsidedness in your pattern. So it's important to make sure you do this. Center it in the proper way, get everything tightened, then you can take it back out and put your bit back in and work with it. And don't forget to secure your piece before you make any cuts. You can do that with clamps if those clamps aren't in the way, or you can use a vise like on this workbench. Then when you're all done, you can just take a little utility knife like this one. Get it in next to there, and it tends to pop the glue right off. You'll have to sand off what remains after you scrape off what you can. It's pretty easy. I do hope that the content in this video will give you some of the confidence that you need to add templating and routering into your woodworking projects. The possibilities with this is really endless, and you can see that the projects can be pretty fun. If you liked what you saw here, hit subscribe. It helps other people find the content that I put out there. And leave me a comment too if there's something else that you would like to see. I'll put the links to the other 2 routering videos that I've done recently at the end of this video here, which is coming up soon. And in the description, I'll provide links to these templates that I use to make the Mancala board. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy watching these videos as much as I do making them, and I hope that you'll see me in another one soon.